Now, remember the Spanish-American War? Probably most of you don't remember it, but it was it was 1898. And as a result of this war, which was truly an imperialistic war, why we ended up controlling Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and all of these countries that had been controlled previously by the Spanish. So in 1902, why the American government, you have term power there, and then the American government granted limited independence to Cuba, but we reserved the right to intervene at any time. By 1928, there was a President Machado who was in power in Cuba. He was pro-communist, and of course when his term in office was up, he refused to leave. So by 1933, they had a dictatorship in Cuba. It was a pro-communist dictatorship, and the army said, we've got to do something about it. 3 sergeants led a bloodless coup. One of them was, of course, Batista. And immediately, in 1933, the United States government recognized Batista's government and immediately granted Cuba full independence. So obviously we supported what he had done. In 1940, a democratic election was held. Batista was elected and, of course, established a free enterprise system, got away from socialism, and things were going pretty well. But by 1944, while the communists were there, they were working. There was another election. Batista lost the election. They didn't have voting machines at that time, but under these circumstances. By 1948, the new regime, of course, was pretty well corrupt, moving towards communism. Batista had actually left Cuba. He'd come to Florida. He would get out of politics. Cuban military asked Batista if he would run for the Senate. Batista said, no, I'm not going to run for the Senate. I'm through. But they put his name in, running for the Cuban Senate. He was elected. So he went back there and of course, began to, was there. The regime was totally corrupt. I mean, they were stealing money. They were supposed to be burning money that was outdated, and they were keeping it, and the country was going from bad to worse. So again, the Cuban military asked Batista to take over control, and of course, they had a revolution, and Batista once again became the temporary dictator of Cuba. Now in 1948, there was a Pan-American conference that was held in Bogota, Colombia. At that time, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro seized the radio station in Bogota and said, this is a Cuban revolution, and I am Fidel Castro leading this revolution. All of our State Department officials were there. They knew Fidel Castro was a communist at that time, but they certainly didn't want the American people to know that. Well, anyway, it was in March of 1952 that Batista led another bloodless coup. Nobody was killed. The following year, on July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro led a revolution where they actually tried to overthrow the government. He failed. He was arrested. He was sent to the Isle of Pines, where he had a private room, a car. He could travel. He could do whatever he wanted to, but he was a political prisoner. Nobody was killed. In November of 1954, another democratic election was held with representatives from around the world, held in Cuba, and of course, Batista was elected by the people president. And Batista made one serious error. He turned Fidel Castro loose. And Fidel Castro then, in December of 1956, after going to Mexico, which most of you don't know, but has been a communist country for many, many years, they had their communist revolution back in the 1930s, and he was able to get all sorts of support for his communist revolution there. Incidentally, we're being invaded by Mexico today, whether you know it or not. Anyway, in 1956, in December, Fidel Castro attacked Oriente province with 150 men. Only 12 or 13 survived. One of them was Fidel Castro. And so in February 1957, why Herbert Matthews was sent by the New York Times to Cuba to interview Fidel Castro and came back and announced that he was the true Robin Hood. He wasn't a communist at all. He was the Abraham Lincoln of the revolution. And Herbert Matthews, over and over again, made a statement, Fidel Castro is not a communist. Articles picked up all across America came to be believed. Of course then, in June of 1957, Ambassador Smith was appointed to become the ambassador. And of course, who do you think that they had brief him about what was going to happen in Cuba? Well, the State Department assigned Herbert Matthews to brief Ambassador Smith. And then, of course, there was an Ambassador Hill, though, who also was very knowledgeable, and he told Ambassador Smith this: "You were assigned to Cuba to preside over the downfall of Batista. The decision has been made that Batista has to go. Be very careful." And so, in August of 1957, the communists began attacking civilian targets in Cuba, and Batista suspended the Constitution temporarily, and immediately we attacked him. He's a dictator. He suspended the Constitution. Just like they've done over in France. Chirac did it this last week, but nobody's calling him a dictator for trying to restore law and order. Well, let's go ahead and play my interview. Ambassador Smith was a financier and corporate director. He held appointments from 3 presidents of the United States. During the years 1957 to 1959, he was the American ambassador to Cuba during that tragic time of the Cuban Revolution when Fidel Castro came to power. Ambassador Smith, can you give me the background of your initial briefing from the State Department before going to Cuba in 1957?
I was briefed in Washington for a period of 6 weeks. And during that time, I was asked to make an appointment with Herbert Matthews of the New York Times so that he could brief me. I think this is of special importance because the fact I don't believe any other American ambassador has ever been briefed by a newspaper correspondent regarding the country to which he was to be appointed to. And it was known at the time that, of course, that Herbert Matthews was a strong proponent of Fidel Castro, and that Fidel Castro was dedicated to the overthrow of the government of Cuba by force.
Now, were you given any inkling of the communist background of Fidel Castro?
I was given plenty of inkling. No, I want to change that. No, I was not. In all the time that I was in Washington, I don't ever recall the State Department saying a good word about Batista, and I don't ever recall them saying a bad word about Fidel Castro.
But did the State Department know about the communist infiltration of Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement?
Oh, I think so. I think it was known from the time of the Bogotazo, which took place in Bogota in 1948. I think the CIA and the FBI and also the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs and the head of the Caribbean Division were both in Bogota at the time, on active duty for the State Department.
So they knew about the communist infiltration, but they didn't relay this information to you?
Well, that is correct.
What about Mr. William Wheeland and Roy Rubottom, who were both in the State Department? What was their background as far as the Bogota uprising, and what part did they play in the bringing of Fidel Castro to power?
Well, as I recall, Rubottom acted as secretary for this is now, we're going back quite a few years, but as I recall it, he was secretary of the mission that was down there and was representing the State Department at that time.
This was in Bogota at the time? In
Bogota at the time. It was called a Bogotazo because one of the leaders of the uprising was Fidel Castro himself.
And was this a communist uprising?
Yes, it was always maintained to be a communist uprising. And not a communist uprising, but an uprising which was led by the communists and instigated by the communists.
Now, what part did Mr. Wheeland and Mr. Rubottom play in the ultimate fall of Cuba in 1959?
Well, Mr. Rubottom and Mr. Wheeland were really the top men of what I call the fourth floor. And the fourth floor is a book, and I wrote a book with that name. It must be taken symbolically. It means where the Latin American officers had their desks in the State Department because they were situated on the fourth floor. And Mr. Wheeland and Mr. Rubottom were the leaders of the fourth floor. They were the top men. Mr. Rubottom was Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, and Mr. Wheeland was the head of the Caribbean Division. And they influenced our actions in Cuba by their day-by-day actions. And they were instrumental in doing everything that they could to see that Fidel Castro was removed from office.
That Fidel Castro was removed from office?
Yeah,
Or
not
Batista?
excuse me, Batista removed from office. I think we'll have to redo that one.
All right. Well, did the State Department actively work to bring Fidel Castro to power?
The State Department actively worked through the day-by-day actions of the men who were situated on the fourth floor. They were the people connected with the Caribbean and all of Latin America. The Secretary of State was completely preoccupied with Berlin and Tokyo and Moscow, so that he left everything to the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, who was Mr. Rubottom.
Did Mr. Wieland and Roy Rubottom, who were from the American State Department, know about the communist influence within Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement?
I don't think that Mr. Rubottom and Mr. Wieland knew that Fidel Castro was a communist, but I do think that they were familiar with the fact of his communist activities as a boy, from the fact that he was an active leader in the uprising in Bogota in April of 1948. At that time, I believe that Fidel Castro was only 22 years of age, and there's no question about that he was an unstable youth.
And what happened at the Bogota uprising in 1948?
Well, the Bogota uprising was a communist-inspired uprising for the overthrow of Gaitan, I think his name was, G-A-I-T-A-N. And it was a communist-inspired uprising which Fidel Castro led the youth end of it, and it is very famous in history.
I see. What did the American State Department do to undermine Batista's position and aid the revolutionary movement of Fidel Castro?
That was done in the day-by-day actions of those on the fourth floor, and the fourth floor must be taken symbolically. That word represents where the officers of the Latin American officers had their desks in the State Department, and in their day-by-day actions they did everything they could, it seemed to me, to undermine Batista and to help Castro.
So what specific things did they do to undermine Batista?
Well, there were about 20 that I've listed, and as I'll give them to you as they come to mind, if you want me to.
All right, please do.
We'll say one of the main things that was done was when they stopped the shipment of arms in 1958, in March of 1958. Under the MAG program, the United States government was supplying arms to Central America and to Latin America. That was for hemisphere defense. There were 1,980 Garland rifles that were to be shipped, and the Fidel Castro group, the 26th of July movement in Washington, were able to persuade the State Department officials that they should cancel that shipment of arms. Now, the actual loss of the arms did not mean so much to the Batista, but it was the psychological effect which had hurt the morale of the people around him and the army officers and his generals. On the other hand, it was a great psychological uplift to the Castro people because they knew that Batista had lost the support of the United States government.
Well, now then, was Batista able to buy weapons from other countries, or did we try to block that?
He got his weapons from the Dominican Republic, from Trujillo, who was the dictator at that time in Ciudad Trujillo. And also, the United States asked other countries not to sell arms to Batista. This is really intervention by innuendo.
What about other military equipment that he needed? Was he able to get other specific things? What about parts for his military vehicles?
No, they also stopped the shipment of parts, airplanes. We sold 15 airplanes, and Batista paid for them, and the State Department canceled it. I call it reneging on a deal, and the excuse was that they could use those planes for bombing the revolutionaries, where they were just plain ordinary training planes. Also, the same thing took place with armored cars. We sold them 20 armored cars, and Batista paid for them, and we never delivered those. due to the pressure which was put on the State Department by the members of the 26th of July movement. And they had their representatives in Washington. They had a legal representative, and we were also dealing with other emissaries.